Well, we'll get started. So as we all know, today we have the pleasure of introducing Sarah Peters and Peter Peters, and they're talk to us about REACH. Peter Peters is, you guys, I don't know how many of you have read about him, but I'll give him a brief introduction. He was born in England and carries an Australian accent as well. Started out as an engineer, but then became an Anglican priest and began his ordained ministry in New South Wales in Australia. And then way back in 1976, came to the United States where he did graduate work at Yale and Vanderbilt and became an ethicist as well. Actually knew him at one point when he joined our ethics committee at RGH for a few meetings. He has done a lot of things around town and elsewhere, and he'll tell you about the rest of his story. Sarah Peters is from Hartford and moved to Rochester early on. After graduating from Wheelock College, her first degree was in early childhood education and then a master's in educational administration. She was with the Churchville Chili school system. And their story together with REACH begins in 2015. I think I'll let you take it from there.
So my job was to introduce ourselves, and we've already had an introduction, but I'm Sarah Peters. And is the mic working okay? Or do I need to lower it? Okay. How's that? Okay, good. Peter and I have been with REACH since the beginning, and Peter will tell the story of REACH, but I've been the secretary pretty much since the first couple of meetings that we had back in 2015. And I'm also part of our development team, and I was actively serving on our tiny home team, but things have gotten pretty busy with my other two jobs with REACH, so I've just kind of casually with the tiny home team now. And I'm going to let Peter introduce himself, and he's going to speak first.
Good morning. Thank you for having us here. I've never been introduced before as an engineer. I was a motor mechanic, or trying to be one. That was my aspiration as a 16-year-old. Does it say engineer there? I don't know who wrote that. Thank you, David. It's delightful to be here. I've had many meetings in this room and appreciate what DUPC does to promote community concerns. So we're going to talk about the story of REACH. And first, I want you to watch.
The city of Rochester is bulldozing all of the personal possessions of many of the homeless who live down at Sanctuary Village. They're now throwing all of the personal possessions in a dumpster. People were assured that they had until December 28th. Certainly over the weekend, many people took temporary shelter options and then were lied to and exploited, and now all of their personal possessions are being destroyed and taken away. Sanctuary Village, Rochester, New York. All under the protection of the Rochester Police Department.
Many of you will know the voice behind that, Ryan Acuff, who has been a valiant defender of people's rights and works very closely with the Citywide Tenant Union these days. And for me, the heart of the issue is, how do we learn to show respect to our neighbors? Here in that movie, people and their belongings are treated as throwaway objects. So what could we do? In response to this action by our city, Sister Grace and Kelly Finnegan of the House of Mercy called a meeting right here in Dupsy. About 100 came. The ask that night was for people to help open a winter shelter for the coming winter, as Sister Grace informed us that the House of Mercy's expansion would not yet be ready. So about 30 of us stayed, and we formed a working task force. This was the starting point of our organization, created by a diverse group of volunteers who cared about people in need and our community. Most of us didn't know each other, and most of us had never worked with persons experiencing homelessness. We had a lot to learn. What's it like to be homeless? Who are the people who experience chronic homelessness? What are their needs? We soon learned that their primary need is to be treated with respect and dignity, and to find a safe, affordable place to call home. As a group, we adopted what we learned about called the Housing First approach. Our shelter would not be punitive, but regenerative. In short, housing first. Well, the notes are not there, but housing first means that the primary need of the homeless is housing. Surprise, surprise. It's actually followed by HUD in the last few years, that it is a better clinical way to help the homeless is to house them. So Reach was born. We became Rochester Emergency Action Committee for the Homeless, known as REACH. We don't use that acronym much anymore, but we use the word REACH because it's become known by what we do. We soon found that in our shelters, that we gave birth to small communities of people who were learning to care for each other and themselves. There is something wrong with these printed notes. It's over to you, I think.
We have several different missions. So our first mission was forming a shelter. We were primarily established to shelter people who are chronically homeless. And for anyone who doesn't know, this population are people who the City of Rochester, the regular shelters, have sanctioned them from being a part of. So they most of our guests have either an emotional issue, mental health issue, substance abuse, and DHS requires that people go to appointments and jump through certain hoops in order to stay in the shelters. And many of our guests are not capable of doing that. From the start, Reach adopted a 24/7 model. In other words, we were open 24 hours a day, which is different than a lot of the shelters at that time in Rochester. Many shelters had guests leave first thing in the morning, and they would have to line up at 6 or 8 o'clock at night for a bed that next evening. So they had to take all their things with them and so on. Reach tried very hard to treat each guest with respect, and this was their home while they were with us. We didn't have any limits of how long a guest could stay in the shelter. We wanted them actually to stay sometimes during the day, because then our social workers would have better access to working with them and helping each guest to figure out what it was that they needed to get on a more positive path. So with the support of Andy Carey and his social work team at MC Collaborative, we worked hard to get people ready for and into permanent housing, where they can feel safe and begin to work on the issues keeping them in homelessness. We soon concluded, though, that the issue is not people who are experiencing homelessness. It's with the housing policies and practices that we have in our city and county. No one is building for the very, very poor in our county. When you hear about affordable housing, that's normally, or the average is people who are earning 60 to 80% of, I'm looking at Peter for verification, 60 to 80% of the area media income. Whereas the people that we're working with, some of them have some income, but it's down at the 20, 30% of the area media income. The average rent in Rochester at the time when we were setting up our shelter was about $700 a month for an efficiency apartment. And today it's closer to $1,200 a month or more. So we became Reach Advocacy. How could we help to change the narrative around housing? And 3 teams emerged to do Reach's mission: the shelter team, the tiny home team, and the advocacy team. After 7 years of providing shelter, so in 2022, let me back up, I'm sorry. In 2022, when we couldn't begin opening shelters safely, so COVID changed many, many things for us. That winter, when we all went into lockdown, we very quickly transitioned our guests to hotels. The city provided hotels that were empty, and people who were experiencing homelessness were moved into their own rooms. We found that to be life-changing for some of our guests, to actually be in their own space. It wasn't their own apartment, but at least it was their own space with their own bathroom, and they knew that their things were going to be safe. And that opened our eyes. So when we were able to open a shelter again, we opened several different sites and gave each guest their own room. This past winter, so 22 into 23, we officially opened Project Haven. Reach really began to grow. We had started out thinking that for one winter, we were going to open a shelter, and then the need just kept spiraling. And so this past winter, we have established something called Project Haven. It is our Reach shelter system. We have 6 shelter sites. Some of the details of the sites are on the slide there. I'm not going to read each slide. The uniqueness of Haven is that the guests can be placed in a shelter designed to meet their needs. Our 6 sites, you're right, Peter, these notes are bad. Our 6 sites include specialty homes, such as a sober living environment, an LGBTQ+ home, a place for women survivors of sexual exploitation, and homes for men and women of varying needs or varying levels of independence. Some of our guests are ready to be put into their own apartment. We can't find an apartment yet, but they're pretty independent. So we have different sites depending on people's needs. A person can move fairly fluidly through our system, depending on their needs. We have no time restrictions, and our goal is to get our guests to a place where they can live independently and with support in their own home. Okay. After a few years of trying to place our guests in permanent housing, we realized that there's not enough available, genuinely affordable and safe apartments. Secondly, some of our guests needed smaller, more private spaces. A large apartment building with people all around you isn't comfortable for some of our guests. Many of them are experiencing trauma or PTSD, and that huge building is overwhelming if someone's up on a higher floor. Now I have to find the second page of the notes, which seems to be on the following page. So we established the tiny home team when we realized that there just was not enough affordable housing. And some of the details about that are on that page. Next slide. This is an architectural rendering of Edgerton Meadows, our Reach tiny home community. We had initially found a lot off of St. Paul Boulevard, and we worked very hard to get that lot cleaned up. We tried talking with the neighbors, and we just couldn't get the neighbors behind us. Most of the buildings in that neighborhood were not owner occupied. The owners were living somewhere else, very hard to get in touch with those owners. And so we couldn't really get buy-in, and we knew that the city would never let us build if we didn't have the neighborhood behind us. So we found a new lot, which is bordered by, it's over near the Edgerton Community Center, and it's bordered by Fulton Avenue, Phelps Avenue, and Bacchus Street. And it's an absolutely wonderful lot. It was a little kind of private street. It wasn't private. It was a street with 6 homes. All the homes were taken down. So it's this acre lot, all kind of self-contained with buildings or homes bordering it. But it's a perfect site for building a community. So our community will be called, or is called, Edgerton Meadows. It's going to include 7 duplexes, most of them with private entrances on not on the same side, so on different sides, so that people feel more like this is their own private home. This first building here, it looks like the entrances are more towards the front. That's because one of our buildings will house our village manager. We'll have someone on site most of the time. And the other part of that duplex will have our community room. We are collaborating with organizations in the city that train city youth in the building trades. 12 to 24 individuals or couples will reside in our village, where they will continue to get support from our social work team. Okay. I think you're next, and you may be able to find your notes on the second page.
So the third team, of which I have the privilege of being the chair, I forgot to announce that I'm no longer the chair of REACH. I've decided at a certain point in my life that it's time to start closing down. I turned 84 this year, and that was time for me to let go of being the chief of the whole program. But I'm running the advocacy team. We're still developing the advocacy team, but we've been pleased to welcome a number of new people on it, and I'm going to give a pitch. If you're at all interested in housing justice and what we're doing, we've got vacancies on the advocacy team. Would be very helpful to have someone from DUPC to be part of that. We see our work as central to the challenges we face around housing justice. We're not alone in this effort. We collaborate on this work with people like the Citywide Tenant Union, who are being more and more empowered to take charge of the buildings that they're living in. In fact, one of them is on the way towards becoming more like a social housing project. So we're pleased about that. And we work and are members of Housing Justice for All, which is an upstate, downstate lobbying coalition, and you are able to see that if you go to their website. We had to find an effective way to start changing the narrative, and I pinched the organizing motto of the late Bruce Popper: to educate, agitate, and organize. Now, some of you may recognize those words. They were actually from Susan B. Anthony when she was organizing for the women's rights to vote. So we're launching we're launching what we think is the, what are you doing?
You know,
We're launching what we hope is a campaign for housing as a human right. If you're interested in that whole issue of housing as a human right, I brought with me a paper that I wrote. I have a few copies. I don't have a lot. They weren't on the table, but housing is a human right. I'd be interested. There are maybe 4 or 5 copies, but it's a 10-page article. You might want to think about taking it up before you, but I brought that with me. One of the things that I think we've got to do, and could you get the book out of my, we've got to start talking about how do we make housing as a human right in this country. Right now, housing is primarily seen as an investment. It is totally driven by the market economy. Here, I did bring a small bibliography about housing and homelessness that is for faith communities. It's designed for people like Dupsy to think more deeply about housing. I highly recommend that you read the last one first. They're simply in alphabetical order. The last one is a very good book speaking about the role of the Christian community in particular in dealing with housing justice. This book here, which I haven't put on that list because it's very secular, and I was just pulling up books that had explicit mention of faith foundations. This book here is a powerful argument for housing as a human right on the basis that what we know, and we've got evidence of it all around, is that the market is not supplying housing for people whose income is below 30% of the AMI. In fact, I had a developer, talked to a developer who's well known in this community, and I admire him for the work he's done in building quote unquote affordable housing. But he looked me in the eye and said, Peter, we can't put a package together unless we're shooting for 60% of the AMI. There are 10,000 people in Rochester who live below 30% of the AMI. I grew up in public housing. My mother was a domestic servant. My father was a ditch digger, a day laborer. We lived in council housing, housing supplied for people like my mother and father. We have not done a good job in this country with public housing. We need to think carefully and critically about our history around public housing. We started well during the Roosevelt era, and there are still some that survived and are well run. Sarah and I visited one in Alabama. It's being exceptionally well run. Lawns manicured, streets clean, public housing. And then we built those high rises and put people in them, warehousing them. And then one of the ironies of our history, the Fair Housing Bill that made it appropriate for everybody to have entitlement to housing, their own house, that actually took people out of those large high rises and put them out into the suburbs as the FHA started funding homes in the suburbs. And in particular, took white people away from that whole business of public housing. And so public housing became predominantly Black and predominantly poor and not supported. We did not fund the maintenance or care of those buildings. So we want to organize a way of helping people talk about housing in a different manner. So here's one of, Can you go back? No, go forward. I've done all that. This is what we want to do. Thank you. We want to try and have conversations that include people who are unsheltered or housing vulnerable with those people who are well sheltered and housing secure. How many people do you know who are housing vulnerable? That's the problem. That is the problem in this country. We don't talk to each other. We don't listen to each other's story. You and I both know that the only way people are transformed is through personal story. And so we want to encourage ways in which people who have or are experiencing chronic homelessness or being housing vulnerable are at the table with people who are comfortably housed. Because we have to change the political narrative around housing. We'd like to recruit people from here to join us in that campaign. And so Sarah's going to end up.
Thank you, Peter. REACH, as you probably have figured out, started out as an extremely small organization of 30 volunteers. And we have ballooned. We have just expanded remarkably to an organization that has 6 shelter sites, is about to break ground, hopefully by next summer, with our tiny home village. And we are trying to expand our advocacy team. So there's plenty of space for anyone that you might know or yourself who would like to help out. There's room on our REACH team for people to support advocacy. There is room on our development team. If you have any experience or know someone who has experience in fundraising or grant writing. And we are looking desperately for an accountant who will do an audit of our accounts. We're finally to the level where we really need to have our accounts audited. And evidently, most of the accountants in our area are just totally booked up. So those are several specific needs, but also please check out our website at https reachadvocacy.org. or sign up for our newsletter. There's a sheet over there if you're not already receiving our newsletter. We did have a vibrant volunteer program for supplying meals, and we're trying to get that back up and organized again. It was easy when we had one site. And now that we have 6 sites, we haven't quite figured out how to manage that so that it's works properly and people can count on meals coming and so on. We certainly are feeding our guests dinner every night, but we don't use as much volunteer support, and we really would like to. That was one, I think, of the most powerful parts of our program was we had a volunteer group coming in every evening to supply dinner, and we invited those volunteers to sit down with our guests and eat with them. And for some people, it was very eye-opening, and others chose to just serve, and that was fine too. So we're trying to get that back up again. Or maybe you have a talent, like you like to lead yoga or sing or something. And we used to have more events where our guests could participate in those kinds of activities. Or join a team, as I said. I've told you the specific needs that we have for our teams. And of course, we always accept donations if anyone's interested. And you can do that right on our website or send checks to the REACH address that I have business cards, or it's on our brochure that's up there. And quickly, the handouts that are on the table, besides the sign up for our newsletter, there is one that tells you more details about Edgerton Meadows, our tiny home community, one that gives you more details about Project Haven, our shelter system. And Peter put 2 handouts up there as he said. And I believe that's the end of our presentation, unless you have something to add. So we will welcome any questions that anyone may have. Oh, thank you.
I've got the mic, so I'm going to ask a question first.
Okay.
You're doing awesome work. It takes a lot of money. I'm just wondering where you get the money. Do you have corporate support? Is it mostly individual donations? Is it faith groups? Is it all of those?
In the beginning, the majority of our money came from all of you, from private donations in the community, and people were wonderful. At that point, our budget, annual budget for the winter shelter between November and April, during our coldest months, was under $100,000. And so private donations worked well. We applied for grants to different churches, mostly faith organizations, Realtors Association. We applied for a lot of other small grants that got us through the winter just fine. Plus, DHS does give us, at that time in the beginning, a very small per person rate during COVID. So DHS the county was supplying some of our funding. Now, our organization to run the 6-site shelter, Project Haven, is well over $1 million a year. So we as an organization are feeling some growing pains, quite honestly, to go from this very small all-volunteer organization to now we have some full-time staff, several full-time staff. One is the executive director of REACH, and then a volunteer and logistics coordinator and a part-time secretary. Besides all the other, we pay a fair wage now, so there's the bookkeepers and so on to make sure that payroll is getting produced appropriately. But anyway, we are applying and have received some more substantial grants. We're waiting for more funding from the county and the city, and we have begun applying for government funding. So we're in a huge change in trying to upgrade our funding streams. Plus the county has last year approved our 6-site shelter. In fact, they're extremely supportive, both the county and the city. They're a little slow sometimes to come through with the money that they promise, but they are supporting us, and they are very much behind REACH's program, which they feel is a good program for our homeless population. What did you want to add?
Well, I think you just did it. I was concerned to make sure that you understood that we went from being a winter shelter to being a year-round shelter. And that, of course, expanded the budget. And that was done because the county really liked what we were doing and made overtures to us. What we've learned, though, and this is one of the struggles that is a not-for-profit organization, they're slow on paying their bills. And so we have a backlog of costs. And so at the moment, we're in a very, very shallow position financially. We're hoping that will change. When Code Blue comes in, the receipts from the county pick up in amounts, but it's still pace-wise. So there's some sense in which what REACH has got to do, and that's why we need more development people, is to raise funds that will be a backlog, enabling us to keep operating while we're waiting for county funds. So if you know anybody that can help with that kind of challenge, let us know.
Yes, hi. How do you determine who qualifies and who does not qualify for a place in one of your shelter? And by the same token, if you have trouble with someone in a shelter, how do you disqualify them or throw them out? Right. Or don't you?
Pretty much anyone who comes to our door is welcome. So we have always had an open door policy. If someone is disruptive then we invite them, we find them another place. We don't just kick people out on the street. We find them another place temporarily until they show that they're ready to come back. And disruptive, of course, you're going to have arguments and so on, but I mean physically or terribly abusive in some way. So our policy has always been to try to meet our guests where they are and work with them so that they can be a healthy, functioning part of the shelter home. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Sarah and Peter, every word you said was compelling.
Oh,
it's just so impressive. And I
Gail.
marvel that you've been able to do this in such a short period of time. I do have a question about, Peter, you said you had a paper that you only had a few copies of. Is there any way we could sign our names and you could send the paper by email?
Do you have it by email, Peter?
Yeah, I did that. I think there are 3 copies.
Yeah, I'd really like it on email because then I can pass it on to other people.
Yeah, yes. So
On the back of the paper that has the sign up for the newsletter, or if your name is already, no, I think you already get our newsletter, but anyway, indicate somewhere on that newsletter sign up sheet that you'd like a copy of the article. Perhaps just put article or something and we'll understand. Okay.
by the way, the pen doesn't work.
Oh, Elaine.
Sarah, you talked a bit about the people that you allow into or invite into the various shelters, and I understand Housing First really requires that first they are sheltered. Could you describe more about how you then identify their needs that are beyond shelter and help them to provide those needs?
The foundation of our program is our social work team. So we have a wonderful social work team led by Andy Carey, who was at the first meeting and has been part of our group since the beginning. There have been other social work groups, PICO and so on, that have worked with us more so in the beginning. But the social work team meets as soon as they can with each guest. Usually our guests come into Barbary Terrace, which is our largest shelter. And usually that's where they enter. The social workers meet with them and identify what their needs are. And perhaps they need a different shelter in our system, or perhaps they're ready to go into some kind of detox program or whatever. So the social workers look at what their needs are and try to place them in the right place in our system or somewhere else. Did that answer your question?
Can I say a little bit more about that? First of all, if any of you know Andy Carey, he is the clue to REACH. Andy taught us all just how to relate to people who are in many ways disoriented or dealing with mental health issues, dealing with addiction issues, survivors of abuse, whatever causes a person to go to the streets to survive. He is an incredible witness to what it means to relate to somebody, giving them the space to say just what they want to do for their next step. He doesn't impose, he invites. And REACH has tried to follow that model all the way through, and that's thanks to Andy Carey. What is important for you to take away is, as much as we try to do that, and as our social work team works aggressively to get people to the place where they are ready for and wanting to enter into their own homes, we used to place 40 to 50% of our guests into some form of permanent housing, most of whom stayed for over a year in that permanent housing. Nowadays, Our social work team can't find the housing. And that's what we have to digest. There is no housing available that is secure. Oh, sure, you can go to a slum housing with an unscrupulous landlord who doesn't do any of the repair work that needs to be done. And that raises another question, is how do we get the city to enforce occupancy standards? So many of the buildings that our people have come from have been substandard buildings where the city enforcement system is not working. So it is a housing crisis. It is not, homelessness is not the crisis. The crisis is housing. The crisis is that we are not spending enough resources on building houses for those people who are falling between the gaps in the housing market. So that's the challenge. How do we get the voice out? Congress is doing a little, but of course, right now we don't even know whether we'll have a Congress effectively working. But they still are not putting enough money into the federal budget to create more widespread public housing. So we have to start talking about it, and talking about it to our friends, to our neighbors, to people that we respect, but most importantly, to our political leadership. That is so important, that we start thinking about housing as a human right, and that where the market is not going to meet the needs, government needs to step in. We do that for schooling. We do it for medicine. We need to do it for housing. We need to say up front, housing is a human right.
I heard I think it was on NPR, about a program, and if I remember correctly, it was in Los Angeles, where a private not-for-profit organization took upon themselves to identify landlords that had open available apartments, and they matched them with the needs of people who needed those. So they acted kind of as a broker, and that was their, if I heard it correctly, was their only mission. Is that something that REACH could provide?
We, in fact, still already do that. We have a list of landlords through our social work team who we can trust, and they trust us. And so, yes, that's already being done. It's being done by the Catholic Family Center. There's a guy by the name of Alex Turner who did a lot of prevention work during COVID for eviction. They do an incredible matching of landlords and possible guests or possible tenants. The Homeless Services Network has an element that does that. There is not a central place for the city doing that, and it would be helpful if something like that happened. But we do it as we treat with the guests we have. But all the time we're meeting landlords whose will is that they will house people who we recommend to them. And by the way, many landlords will not accept people who are on vouchers. And that's what you may have heard of as Section 8, where people are given income, or at least that the apartment is subsidized through a voucher. Many landlords won't do that, which might allow some people to get into housing that, quote unquote, is affordable, might get them to the 60% level of AMI. But if landlords won't do it, so that's a great model that you cite from Los Angeles. We need to strengthen that in this town. But we do it incrementally through our small system. And I know that Catholic Family Center does it as well. Thank you for that. That's a great observation.
Your comment on public housing reminded me, there's a recent book out called Poverty by America.
Oh, yes.
And one of the things that the book pointed out was that for public housing, that despite public perceptions of it, that people in public housing fare better than people in substandard apartments that they find on their own.
That's an excellent point. Yeah. If you haven't read it, Poverty by America is the latest book by Matthew Desmond, who wrote the book you may have read called Eviction. And that book was an earlier book that he did based up in Minneapolis, where he described the effects of rotating eviction. He followed families who were being evicted and what was happening to them and how that deteriorated their whole family life and whole sense of security. It's a very compelling book. He's followed it up with a much more compelling book about Poverty by America, and basically argues that our capitalist economy is intentionally building a society that's built on capital and not human care. And we need to read that book. And I have to tell you, I'm not ashamed to say that much of my thinking is in the socialist realm. In fact, when I was parish priest in Fairport, one of my members would say to me, "Peter, that sounds like socialism." And I would say, "Yeah, I think that's what Jesus taught us." but you know, we've got to take stock of it. We've got this blind faith that our capitalist system is going to take care of everybody in a trickle-down method. That is not true. It is not working. So yeah, that's a great book, and thank you for bringing that up.
I believe that's the book that our church is reading for book clubs. We attend Two Saints down the street from you, and a book club is just starting up, a Zoom book club. I think it starts November 7th. If anyone's interested, you could probably go to the Two Saints website, and I know you could sign up. Often we collaborate with other churches in our book clubs. So anyone would be welcome if you would like to read Poverty by America and join with other people in conversation. It's Tuesday evenings. I don't remember the time it starts, but it doesn't begin till November 7th. So
I just want to add, Peter, that book Eviction, it not only covers those that are being or have been evicted, but it covers those that benefit by those evictions. And that was, for me, that was just kind of mind-blowing.
The director of Family Promise was here speaking last week, and she talked about the fact that we would be surprised at the number of people in Rochester who are living in their cars. Mm-hmm. So what I would ask you folks is, do you have any programs or anything that addresses that specific issue?
Not that specific issue, but during COVID, when we had to close our shelters, we put our social workers went out on the streets, and they've continued walking the streets. I don't remember if it's one afternoon a week or two, but anyway, they're out on the streets in our most impoverished areas of the city, talking to people and trying to identify who is in need of some kind of housing. But specifically people in cars, I know we've had guests who were living in cars, but I don't know anything more.
Two things. One, we do not house families. Family of Promise does a wonderful job of housing families, and really appreciate what they do. But I'm going to tell you a story. We did house a lady who was living in her car. She came to us 2 years ago. a wonderful lady. She had moved here from the South to be with her family. Unfortunately, she experienced some abuse in that family. She was a grandmother, but apparently the parents allowed the children to be really quite abusive, and she felt unwanted. And so she moved out and started sleeping in her car. Andy met her in one of the street outreach we do on Jefferson Road, and she came to Reach. She's a well-educated woman, and she had modest resources, and we found her an apartment, and she qualified. This is an ESHI-funded apartment on the new buildings in the Beltway. And she qualified, and she went there, applied, and the management of those apartments said, you won't fit in. No reason. So this poor woman was left with us for over a year, sleeping in our shelter. A lovely lady. She now has an apartment. She's now very comfortable. But it's that kind of stuff that goes on that we need to have a much more aggressive way of policing publicly funded managed apartments. How I don't know the basis for them saying she would not fit in. She was a person of good personal standing in my experience. I wrote a story. If you ever read our newsletter, she's in our newsletter. So that was one of the situations that we face. So even if we pick people up in their car, we can't place them.
And I forgot to add when I was talking about our tiny home village, one reason we came up with the concept of the tiny home village, our project is small. It will only house 12 to 24 people, but we're hoping that other nonprofit organizations in the city or other groups will follow our model. When we first started and created this model, there wasn't any zoning for tiny homes. And the city was very much poo-poo to our idea. They just really didn't think it would work at all. And slowly we've worked with them, and we've talked to a bunch of, construction people and so on, developers, excuse me. And our plan is very highly accepted by the city now. And so we've laid the groundwork, and we're hoping that our village can be a model for other villages to be built, because that's another solution to affordable housing. And we've run out of time, I bet.
Looks like you've run out of time. No, this is both exciting and disturbing, isn't it? It's there's such a need, and we thank you for the drop in the ocean. So